Relocating to another culture is stressful and requires learning to adapt to living as a minority in a majority culture. In this episode, we'll look at this adaptation process and some of the dynamics at work as we adjust to another culture. As we've already discussed, this begins with understanding underlying values. How do we deal with culture shock in ourselves and in others? What are some of the negative outcomes of trying to go native, quote unquote? And how do we best identify with the host culture?
Welcome to another of Dr. Phil's Leadership Matters podcast. In this series, Phil will be sharing from his decades of serving and leading multicultural teams from Africa to Eastern Europe to Latin America. Just click the link in the description box to download our free resources or the complete study guide. You can also access any of his other podcasts by going to icmcanada.org/leadershipmatters.
Adjusting to another culture that is different than our own can be very stressful. They call it culture shock for a reason. For those who have always been part of the majority in their own culture, it can be quite a shock to come in as a minority. This stress, added to the other stresses in their lives, will have an adverse impact on their ability of your team to function until they're able to adapt. In the description box, you can get access to a stress test chart from the reference section of these materials. This may be helpful for you or your team members. However, I should point out that I have used this around the world, which is stressful in some cultures is not considered stressful by others, and so even this test has its cultural limitations. It was, of course, written from a Western mindset where everything is stressful. Now, a natural response of new team members is to bond with others of their own nationality. While this is helpful initially, eventually they need to build relationships with those from the host culture. From our time living in Africa, as well as in Berlin, I observed that some new missionaries spend most of their time with other missionaries and found it increasingly difficult to connect with other nationals. While everyone adjusts at their own pace, if one has made the decision to live in another culture, intentional steps should be made to connect with those in that culture. Now, there are at least two dynamics that occur as we form teams in another culture. On one hand, the team is adapting to the host culture, and on the other hand, they are also having to adapt to the culture of each other, which may be quite different and quite far from their culture. One of the greatest challenges of adaptation is in the area of language. Even if a common language such as English is being used, team members often are also learning the local language, which adds to their stress levels. Helping new team members understand the local culture and how to adapt is also crucial for them to be productive members of the mission. This initial process of culture shock should not be underestimated. Short-termers often experience culture stress, but the more serious culture shock is experienced by long-termers, those who are staying at least 2 years or more. This exchanging of one set of behavioral cues for new unknown ones is not an easy process. Often, along this journey, team members will feel like they have been transported into a context where everyone has changed all the rules and they're just trying to catch up with all the changes. Some of the symptoms of culture shock may include a negative and suspicious view of locals and their ways and values. There's a homesickness often, loneliness, boredom, it could be lethargy, a tendency to withdraw. Rising stress and overall feelings of dissatisfaction or disgust, irritability, and even depression. Physical illness, chronic headaches, hypertension, worrying about one's health, outbursts of anger, hurt feelings, just to name a few. There's many options. I've observed that if a newcomer, though, spends most of their time complaining about the way life is, from the potholes to what they perceive as inefficiencies, it is likely they will soon be on a plane back home. The challenges on multicultural teams then is that there are different levels of distances between cultures and how this impacts the ministry. These have been identified as M1, or ministry within the same culture, M2, which is ministry within a close language or culture, which is not as easy and this requires different approaches. And finally, M3, which signifies ministry within a totally strange language and culture, which is considerably most difficult. For example, as this relates to culture shock, an Asian living or serving in another Asian culture could be M2. and may experience as much culture shock and stress as moving to an M3 context, depending on what country they're in. While the adjustments to the food, the climate, and living conditions are the obvious adjustments required, the more important ones, particularly long-term, are the psychological and social adaptations necessary. This, along with relating to other members of a multicultural team, who, by the way, are going through the same process and adjustment, is what causes increased challenges for these multicultural teams. So in order to help new members adjust, besides the logistics of meeting their basic physical needs and helping them lead a balanced life, it is also crucial that the leader facilitates the making of new friends and helping them make a real connection with members of the team. As a team leader, what steps can you take in order to decrease the stress levels of team members coming from other cultures? Identify the cultural differences each team member is experiencing with regards to the host culture and the culture of the other team members that they're associated with. We need to be aware of how team members are doing and watch for symptoms of culture shock. One extreme form of culture shock is the concept sometimes described as going native. Now, going native is the unhealthy form of identification based on compulsion to belong to the very society and culture that is causing them the stress. This often involves giving up one's own values in order to be accepted. The host culture is often romanticized rather than viewed objectively, and one's own culture is rejected as well as that of others, possibly other team members who belong to it. Now, the opposite to this reaction is the anti-native response. This is the uncritical acceptance of one's home or passport culture and seeing its values as far superior and therefore rejecting the very host culture that we're part of. This ethnocentricity we talked about. These are the people who incessantly complain about everything from the food to the transportation and so on. Now, if either of these persist in a team member, it is advisable that they return to their home culture for them to gain perspective and achieve some equilibrium. Often these are signs of a deeper problem, which the stress of a different culture have a way of surfacing. How about paying attention to your team members who is either trying to go native or displaying anti-native behaviors and attitudes? And develop a personal relationship with them so that you can help them through this phase.
You can view or listen to any of Phil's other podcast series by going to icmcanada.org/leadershipmatters. These include Mentoring Intelligence, Finishing Our Race, the Fivefold Ministry, as well as a variety of other leadership series he has taught over the years. You could also check out our Christian Leadership Institute, which is a unique competency-based ministerial mentorship. To download any of our resources associated with these series, visit our library of materials at icm.org/resources.
There are typically 4 phases of cultural adjustment. It begins with a honeymoon or tourist phase where everything is new and exciting. The next phase is the stage of disenchantment or culture shock where reality begins to set in. This is when one realizes that they have bought a one-way ticket and are going to be here for a while. The third phase is that of a period of resolution, which should lead to the final adjustment stage in which one feels at home in the host culture. What occurs in the resolution stage is very important for the long-term health of the member. The patterns that are established in this time tend to stay with a person for the rest of their time in that culture. Now, the foreign worker has a greater likelihood of adapting to the culture if they sense the acceptance and appreciation of others. If, however, they remain to themselves and don't identify with the host culture during this time, it is more likely they will never bond and never identify with the culture and will likely not become an effective team member. It is important to help the foreign team members realize that to be effective in the host culture, the goal is not to be a native, for the reality is that they will always have their own cultural identity. Rather, the goal is to help them appreciate and identify the new culture they are in and contribute to it. Soon after we moved to Kenya many years ago, I remember a Kenyan co-worker telling me that locals were not impressed with the Westerners who try to become more African than the Africans themselves. You'll never be what you are not, but you can learn to identify with the local culture. Over the last half of the 20th century, the influence of mass media from the West, particularly Hollywood and movies, has created certain impressions about the Western culture. Like it or not, those in many non-Western nations have assumed and have assumptions about the cultural values of Western team members that may or may not be true. Many from other cultures have learned English through watching movies, and so this is their context for understanding the culture. While those from the West recognize that the values expressed through movies are not necessarily accurate, this fact can be lost on those viewing the culture from a distance. So all aspects of Western cultural influence have obviously been assimilated into many other cultures. It is important to remember that the assimilation of these activities does not mean that those in these societies do not love their traditional values or cultures. They may like the movies and eat the fast food, from the global chains, but this does not mean that they do not hold deep-seated values based on their own culture. To assume otherwise will create misunderstandings as we develop relationships with each other. I've observed that the closer the culture is to our own, the greater the tendency to assume their values are the same as ours. When you get off the plane, for instance, in Africa, it smells, feels, and looks quite different. It's obvious you're going to need to adjust. But if you get off the plane in Europe, it's easy to think, hey, they look kind of just like me, this adjustment is going to be pretty easy. And yet this is not the case. The cultural adjustment may be even harder depending on how close or far the values of that culture are from our own, depending on what the externals look like. Regardless of what they look like, we're going to have to make some serious adjustments. Evaluating which cultural adjustment phase each of your team members are experiencing. Maybe talk to them about it and help them in this process. So incarnation is at the core of what it means to identify with others. Incarnational ministry means learning to adapt in order to share the good news. Paul mentioned that he learned to become all things to all men so that he may win some. But some of the practical issues that need to be discussed include what lifestyle we will have and how this will impact our ability to identify. This does not mean that we must live like the locals, as this can backfire, as you saw, and create lasting barriers, as it can seem kind of plastic and inauthentic. Often those who come to a host country can afford a lifestyle much higher than those that they are serving. Obviously, this too can isolate them and cause them to not identify and therefore limit their influence on the team and the ministry. Becoming an insider, quote unquote, does not mean that we must give up all our cultural values, but it does mean understanding and appreciating the local culture so that we will become a credible, valuable person in that host culture. And this goes beyond merely conforming outwardly in how we dress or our lifestyle or our mannerisms. Outward adaptability does not necessarily mean identification has taken place and credibility has been established. This is a matter of the heart. And as the degree of outward identification is specific to each situation and a host of other factors. As in our discussion with going native versus anti-native, it is key to understand the maturity and motivations of the team members and to help them in this process as they're growing and as they're adapting. Discuss with your team ways in which each member can identify with the host culture. Now, the expectations of team members and others in the host countries are also important factors in helping the team members identify and adapt in the new culture. Helping them understand these expectations and the reasons behind cultural norms is a responsibility of the team leader. The issue of each team member must wrestle with is how far must they adapt to build credibility without losing their own identity. Let me explain this by using 4 overlapping circles, kind of like as a bullseye target in the diagram that you see there. Now, the outer circle or ring, labeled with the letter A, represents values one can change without a sense of a loss of identity. Now, the next circle, moving inwards, labeled with the letter B, are values that one sees the need to change, and though willing, it will take time, as these are habits of comfort, though maybe not real convictions. Perhaps issues regarding our food or entertainment preferences. Now, the next circle moving towards the center is labeled C, and these are values that one really struggles with to change as they're linked to our perception of our personal identity. And they're pretty deep, and they go really to who we are. And then finally, the small circle at the very center, represented by the bullseye, the letter D, represents the most important values and therefore the most difficult to give up without losing one's identity or integrity. And these are virtually impossible to change. They really become our non-negotiables. It's important to help each team member identify their personal values, particularly those at the very core of who they are. This will help them recognize those things that they can change without changing who they are as a person. Indigenization does not mean an uncritical acceptance of a culture, any culture. Being under the highest authority, the Word of God, should inform our view of our own culture and that of the host culture. As the team builds credibility and respect, members from a variety of cultures can be a net benefit to the local ministry as they collectively bring a perspective of God's Word from their culture, and this can bring a focus as to what is the core of the gospel versus what is just mere our own culture. This includes separating the biblical perspective of sin versus what is just culturally conditioned as wrong or unacceptable. What can you do to help team members not lose their own identity while building credibility in the culture? What are some of the issues your team deals with in regards to cultural values and what is sin? Well, as you can see, adapting to another culture is not so straightforward. It's not like being a tourist. And we don't really have the time to go into great detail here, but just providing a brief roadmap. But in order to not get caught in a culture shock loop, we have to help our team take the right steps in order to successfully go through the phases of adaptability in order to identify with the culture that God has called us to. This may be in a foreign country or in a subgroup within our own country. Next time, we want to continue on this topic of adaptability by discussing some of the principles regarding communication and language, issues of trust, and team structure. I hope you'll be able to join me then.
Thank you for listening to Leadership Matters and subscribing and sharing us. If you would like to have your own copy of this study, just click on the link in the description box. For any of our other leadership resources, check out our website, www.icmcanada.org/resources.